We're going to be talking about the New England colonies today. So, last we left off, we were talking about the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth. And although that first winter was really harsh and about half of them died, the colony was successful. And so, large number of Puritans began to settle in that nearby Plymouth County. They were fleeing religious persecution from King James I. They wanted the ability to practice their religion um, in a place where they weren't going to fear being killed or jailed. Their settlement eventually grew and grew and grew, becoming the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Plymouth Colony joined with the Massachusetts Bay Colony to form the Colony of Massachusetts. Puritan congregations would form their own towns that all functioned around the church. So in Puritan communities, church was like 99.95% of their life. It was super important. Everyone in town was required by law to attend church services. They were hours long, and the communities were a large part of this New England culture that would grow throughout the decades. In this religion and in these communities, they emphasized duty, godliness, hard work, and honesty. The meeting houses where they met for church services and town businesses were simple buildings without any decorations. Their clothing was simple. Their lives were simple. They rejected things that would distract them from work or worship because they believed that that would lead them to laziness. All right. So in your notes, you're going to look for New England colonies where it says colonies, geography, and economy. And when you see the red, you're going to fill that in. So Massachusetts colony became one of the 4 colonies to form in the New England. So right here is Massachusetts. Later, it would become Massachusetts colony was up here where this would turn into Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Another Puritan congregation started the colony of Connecticut. Ironically, the story has a little twist here. So if you remember, the Puritans fled England because they were being persecuted. They wanted religious freedom. So they left England to go to Connecticut. Then there grew out of Connecticut a group that disagreed with these teachings. And so rather than say, hey, we fled, they drove them out of Massachusetts or out of Connecticut. And so that's how Rhode Island basically got established. So groups of people started in England. They started their own colonies in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And then people who didn't agree with that religion, they left and started their own colony in Rhode Island. This was established by Roger Williams when he was forced to leave Massachusetts because of his own beliefs. Also, you've got New Hampshire. The New England colonies share many similarities. New England colonies, if you were to describe all of them, they'd be described as close religious communities. Religion was a common priority. The climate and geography in this region also kind of limited the crops that could be grown there. And so this kind of then led to, like, if I can't grow cotton in New England, I'm not going to run a cotton farm. So the geography and climate really kind of determined what kind of jobs and would drive their economy. When we talk about their geography, the New England colonies bordered the rugged and rocky Atlantic coastline. The soil was hard and rocky. The region lies further north, and they experience long, cold winters where the ground is frozen for months. The cold temperatures and rocky soil made growing crops difficult. If you were to go further from the ocean inland, you would find vast hilly wilderness filled with dense forests. Colonists living in this region found that they could not easily farm the land. So their economy is not driven by farming, although they did exist. So most families would do something called subsistence farming methods. And basically they would just grow like home gardens. They would have a garden that was big enough where they would get enough food to feed their family throughout the winter. The dense forests provided trees for lumber. They would take the cut trees and use them to build ships, and then they would send lumber supplies to Europe to sell for profit. There was also a lot of fishing and whaling, and the forest provided animals for hunting and the fur trade. So make sure you capture that information. Pause if you need to fill in any of these boxes on your notes. All right, the next colonial region that we're going to focus on is the middle colonies. So, unlike the New England colonies that really their lives were centered around their religion, it kind of defined what their life looked like, how their culture was. The middle colonies were not centered around a specific religion, but rather focused on business and trade. As the colonies continued to grow, as more and more people immigrated over from Europe, the middle colonies became home to some of the most diverse settlers who brought with them a variety of beliefs and skills. Uh, in 1664, the colony of New Netherlands was taken over by the British and renamed New York. It was already a big center of trade based on its location and proximity for having a port. And they were a very active port, importing and exporting goods all over the world. A religious group known as the Quakers arrived in North America, and like their predecessors before them, they were also seeking religious freedom. They believed in living a simple life and treating all people equally. William Penn was given a grant of land that he named Pennsylvania. He called the capital city Philadelphia. And even today, Philadelphia is known as a city of brotherly love. That's what Philadelphia stands for. And in one of his great laws of 1682, he promised people of all faiths would be treated equally. Pennsylvania became a prosperous, peaceful colony of diverse people from many countries. Here we see William Penn. So remember, this is where you guys are going to capture the information in your notes. So the four middle colonies are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They are grouped together because they share similar geographic and economic features. Unlike the soil of New England, right? Remember from the other day that that's the rocky soil. The middle colonies had good soil along its coastline. The Hudson and Delaware rivers provided access for ships and became natural trade routes. They also had lush valleys and wooded mountains. A lot of people, even today, vacation in that area for the scenic views. The winters are not as long or cold as the New England region, and so because they don't have these extreme temperatures, the mild winters allow that they could have these bigger farms. So New England had family farms, you just grow enough to get you through the winter, whereas when you have that milder winter, they could have larger farms to grow a variety of crops and raise many different kinds of animals. The diversity of settlers also meant that the homes were made from a wider variety of materials. Dutch settlers built homes and buildings out of bricks. So feel free to pause this so that you guys can capture that information into your notes. The middle colonies had the mild climate and good soil. So it had the better farming than the New England region. So their economy and the abundance of grains like wheat, barley, and rye grown in these colonies gave this region the nickname the breadbasket. Large farms throughout the region grew a variety of crops and raised many livestock animals for profit. The major rivers like the Hudson and Delaware were perfect, so that when the merchant ships, they could access all the different cities, picking up different goods and leaving certain goods. And then these cities grew prosperous and became bustling centers of trade. And even today, cities like New York City and Philadelphia, they were the largest in the British colonies, and they still remain large cities today. The diverse culture welcomed a variety of people who brought with them their skills and trades. So craftsmen could make many useful items like different tools, plows, kettles, and clocks that could be sold in markets or exported around the world for profit. If you remember, one of the reasons that Jamestown was successful was because John Rolfe realized that the South soil and their climate, that they had a year-round growing season, was ideal for growing cash crops like tobacco and rice. So a cash crop is something that you're going to grow a ton of. You're going to have acres and acres and acres of it because your intention is to sell it for profit. Became the livelihood of the southern colonial region, where the settlers' motivation for business and profit rather than for religious reasons. So when you think about like New England, A lot of the settlers there came for religious reasons. They had little bit more of a diverse economy, whereas the South was really about cash crops. Raising cash crops required a lot of land and labor. So wealthy Englishmen came and established large-scale farms called plantations. The large scale of plantation farms created a demand for slaves that were kidnapped and brought from Africa. The slave trade grew, and by 1750, 40% of the population in the South were enslaved Africans. So they've got almost about half, right? The other half being Englishmen. Southern plantations were large and spread apart. They were located near wide rivers so that the merchant ships could dock to load and unload goods. There weren't really a lot of large cities because you don't grow cash crops in the cities, right? Like the plantations and the workers produced pretty much everything that was needed. So here we got some images. All right, so here's where you're going to take notes. It's probably a good idea, just as you did before, to kind of color code your colonial regions. Coloring kind of helps us to notice and to differentiate. So the southern colonies were kind of defined by these large spread out plantations. Tobacco grew well in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. In South Carolina, Eliza Lucas introduced indigo as a crop that yielded a deep blue dye, and they would use that dye for dyeing wool and cotton fabrics. You know, we take it for granted that we can go to the store and buy a blue shirt. That wasn't always the case. You would need some kind of dye, and so that was what was introduced in South Carolina. South Carolina and Georgia were also perfect for growing rice. Planters from the area sought out slaves from West Africa because they were skilled in rice growing. Slave labor allowed planters to become even more wealthy. Later, cotton would become a lucrative export. Southern plantation owners began to act similarly to the wealthy nobility. So in England, you've got those social classes of the monarchy, and then you've got the wealthy nobility. Here in the colonies, they didn't necessarily have that, but in the South, these wealthy plantation owners began to act like that wealthy nobility back in England, who had used poor serfs to work their fields for many generations. So make sure you get the 5 colonies that encompass the southern colonies, as well as the goods that kind of define their economy. The South geography was kind of known for their climate, for their short, mild winter months, and good soil. This meant that the plantations could flourish and they can grow crops nearly year-round. The wide rivers and vast wetlands gradually merged with the sea, and the broad, flat rivers flowed to the Atlantic coast, and each plantation could have their own dock. Cash crops from the plantations were loaded onto merchant boats. Then those merchants would also bring goods for the plantation owners to buy. There was very little need for large, bustling cities, since the plantations, they got everything that they needed. Either they had it, or the boats that came to pick up the goods would have it. So they were self-sufficient. The slaves not only worked the fields growing the cash crops, but they tended to large gardens that grew most of the food needed. Some slaves were specially trained in skills such as carpentry and blacksmithing, and they were able to build almost everything that the plantation needed. As a summary, the regional differences in economies and cultures of the 3 regions were all very different. So because this region is very different than this region, has a very different climate and geographical features than this region, those regional differences resulted in having 3 regions that were very different in their economics and cultures. Another important takeaway from this unit is that settlers formed their own governments based on values of democracy and self-government. They did not bring with them a dictatorship type of government. They did not bring with them an aristocrat government. They didn't even rely on principles of theocracy, which is like a religious-based one, or a monarchy. They formed governments based on values of democracy and self-government. This is going to become really important. However, it's still key to note that they remained under the protection and control of Great Britain. They are not resentful of that. They are very proud to be under the same flag as Britain. You can pause and copy on this screen onto your notes. You can use a little bit of shorthand on this. However, these 3 key points are very important, so don't cut too much that you're taking away from that importance.